My husband forgot my birthday for 8 years. I forgot he existed. Every year it was the same thing. My birthday would come, and Roger would act like it was just another Tuesday. No card, no flowers, no dinner, nothing. He'd come home from work, ask what was for dinner, and watch TV until bed. When I'd mention it was my birthday, he'd say we were too old for that stuff and birthdays were for kids. He'd say real adults didn't need parties and presents. But Roger's birthday was different. He'd start talking about it 2 months before. He'd send me links to expensive watches and golf clubs. He'd make restaurant reservations at places that cost $300 per person. He'd invite his friends over for poker nights and expect me to cook for everyone. He'd sulk if his gifts weren't perfectly wrapped with ribbons and bows. For his 40th birthday, he wanted a surprise party. I spent 3 months planning it. Rented a private room at his favorite steakhouse, invited 50 people, hired a photographer, and ordered a custom cake shaped like his vintage car. He loved it and told everyone I was the perfect wife who knew exactly how to treat her man. 2 weeks later was my 40th birthday. Roger went golfing. Didn't even say happy birthday when he left. Came home at 8 p.m. and asked why dinner wasn't ready. I reminded him it was my birthday. He said I should have reminded him earlier and grabbed a beer. That was year 8 of this. 8 years of my birthdays being nothing, while his were productions. His mother, Nancy, would call him at midnight on his birthday, singing to him. She'd never once called me on mine, even though I'd been married to her son for almost a decade. She'd actually told me that women who expected birthday celebrations were high maintenance. Roger's sister would post long Facebook messages about what an amazing brother he was on his birthday. On mine, she'd post about random things like her new diet. Roger kept a list on his phone of everything he wanted for birthdays and Christmas. He'd check items off as he received them and complain if something was the wrong brand or color. When I asked him once what he was getting me, he said my gift was being married to him. He actually said that with a straight face. Year 9 was when I stopped trying. My birthday came and went without a word from Roger. He didn't even notice I'd taken the day off work. I spent it at a spa using money from my separate account, which he didn't know about. I'd been saving $20 here and there for months. When I came home relaxed and happy, he complained that I looked different and asked if I'd changed my hair. I said no and made his dinner like always. But I also started planning. For Roger's birthday that year, I did absolutely nothing. The day came, and he woke up expecting breakfast in bed. I was already dressed for work. He asked where his special breakfast was. I asked what was special about a random Thursday. He said it was his birthday. I said birthdays were for kids, and real adults didn't need that stuff. Just repeated his exact words back to him. He waited all day for surprise plans. Nothing happened. No party, no dinner reservation, no gifts. His mother called, asking what time the party started. I told her there was no party because Roger said we were too old for birthday celebrations. She called Roger, screaming about how I was a terrible wife. Roger came home furious, asking where his gifts were. I said gifts were childish, and he should be grateful for having a job and a house. He said I was being petty and vindictive. I said I was being exactly like him. He claimed he'd never forgotten my birthday. I pulled out my journal where I'd documented every single birthday for 9 years. What he did, what he said, how he made me feel. 9 years of being told I was too old for birthdays while he acted like a child about his. Roger said that was different because men's birthdays mattered more since they were providers. I laughed so hard I cried. I made the same salary as him. We split the bills equally. He wasn't providing anything special. His friends started calling, asking why I'd canceled his birthday plans. I told them Roger decided birthdays weren't important anymore. They thought he was having a midlife crisis. His sister posted asking if Roger was okay since there were no birthday photos. His coworkers wondered why he didn't bring in the usual birthday cake I'd always sent to his office. Roger tried to throw his own birthday party the next week. He sent out a Facebook event invite at 10 p.m. 20 people marked themselves as coming. By 7 the next evening, our living room had balloons Roger bought himself and a store cake still in the plastic container. Michael showed up at 7:30 with a six-pack, looking around at the empty house. Roger kept checking his phone, refreshing the event page. Nobody else came. Michael asked what happened to everyone. Roger said they must be running late. We sat in the living room for an hour. Michael made small talk about work and the weather. Roger opened beer after beer, getting quieter with each one. Michael finally asked why I canceled the original plans. I said Roger decided birthdays weren't important. Michael looked between us, clearly trying to figure out what he'd walked into. Roger said it was complicated. Michael asked if we were having problems. Roger said everything was fine and drank more beer. Michael left around 9:30, saying he had an early morning. Roger sat on the couch surrounded by unopened decorations and that sad grocery store cake. He didn't say anything to me. Just kept drinking and staring at his phone like his friends might suddenly appear. I went to bed and left him there. The next morning, Roger came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He said he might have overreacted about his birthday. He said we should just forget the whole thing and go back to normal. I poured my coffee and asked what normal meant to him. He said normal like before, when things were good between us. I told him normal meant 9 years of him ignoring my birthday while I planned elaborate parties for his. I said I wasn't interested in that arrangement anymore. Roger said I was making this into a bigger deal than it needed to be. He said we could both just move forward and put it behind us. I asked if he actually thought 9 years of treating me like I didn't matter was something we could just move past without addressing it. He got that frustrated look he always gets when I don't immediately agree with him. Roger said I was being dramatic about a few missed birthdays. He said he probably said happy birthday most years, and I was exaggerating everything. He claimed his memory wasn't perfect, but he definitely acknowledged my birthday sometimes. I set down my coffee and went to the bedroom. I pulled my journal from the drawer where I'd kept it hidden for years. Roger followed me, asking what I was doing. I opened to the first entry about my birthday and started reading the date out loud. Roger's face changed as I read his exact words from that day. I flipped to the next birthday entry and read that too. Then the next one. 9 years of detailed entries with dates and direct quotes of everything he said and did. Roger stood there watching his own behavior documented in my handwriting. His face went from defensive to pale. He reached for the journal and I handed it to him. He sat on the bed and read through the entries without saying anything. The silence stretched out for 10 minutes while he turned pages. Then he looked up and said, I kept this journal specifically to use against him someday. He said I'd been planning this confrontation all along, collecting evidence like I was building a case. I sat down next to him and explained I started writing things down because I felt crazy. I told him I thought maybe I was being too sensitive about something that shouldn't matter. I said every year after my birthday passed with nothing, I'd question whether I was remembering it right or expecting too much. The journal helped me know I wasn't making it up. Roger stared at the pages and said it felt like a trap. I asked how documenting the truth was a trap. He didn't answer. Roger closed the journal and handed it back to me. He said if birthdays were so important to me, I should have communicated that clearly instead of keeping score in a secret journal. I reminded him about the multiple times I mentioned feeling hurt when he forgot. He said he didn't remember those conversations. I opened the journal again and showed him entries where I'd written about telling him how I felt. He'd responded every time by saying adults don't need birthday celebrations. Roger said that was just his opinion, and I should have pushed back harder if I really cared. I asked how much harder I was supposed to push when he dismissed my feelings every single time. He said he didn't know I was that upset. I pointed at 9 years of documentation proving otherwise. He got up and left the room. We barely spoke for 3 days after that. Roger moved his stuff into the guest room without asking or explaining. He left for work before I woke up each morning. He came home late and went straight to the guest room. I'd hear him in there watching TV until past midnight. On the third day, I got a text from someone at Roger's office asking if everything was okay. Apparently, Roger seemed distracted and off his game. His coworker wanted to know if something was going on at home. I didn't respond. Roger's problems at work weren't my responsibility anymore. On the fourth morning, my phone rang while I was getting ready for work. The caller ID showed Roger's mom. I almost didn't answer but knew she'd just keep calling. I picked up and before I could say hello, she demanded to know why I was punishing her son over something petty and childish. She said Roger was miserable and it was my fault. I asked if Roger told her what actually happened. She said he told her I was upset about birthdays and making his life difficult. She launched into a lecture about how marriage requires sacrifice and compromise. She said relationships take work, and I needed to be more understanding. I listened to her talk about sacrifice while thinking about 9 years of me sacrificing everything. She said compromise meant meeting in the middle. I wondered where the middle was between everything and nothing. I interrupted her and said Roger learned his entitled behavior from somewhere. I told her maybe she should examine her own role in teaching him that his needs matter more than everyone else's. I said she'd enabled him his entire life by treating his birthdays like national holidays, while telling me women who want birthday celebrations are high maintenance. She made it sound like I'd slapped her. Then she said Roger deserves better than a vindictive wife who holds grudges. She hung up before I could respond. I finished getting ready for work, and wasn't even surprised when my phone buzzed with a text notification. The text was from Roger's sister. It was 3 paragraphs long about family loyalty, and how I was tearing the family apart over nothing. She used multiple crying emojis. She said Roger was her brother and she'd always support him no matter what. She said I was being cruel and unreasonable. She said family means sticking together through disagreements. I read the whole thing and didn't reply. 20 minutes later, she sent another text asking if I got her message. I still didn't respond. An hour after that, she posted a vague Facebook status about fake family members who abandon you over minor disagreements. The post got 15 likes from Roger's relatives. I turned off my phone and went to work. Roger came home that evening carrying flowers from the grocery store. He set them on the kitchen counter and said he'd been thinking about everything. He said he wanted to work on our marriage. He suggested we see a counselor together to help us through this rough patch. I looked at the flowers still in their plastic sleeve and felt something like hope for the first time in days. Then Roger added that the counselor could help me understand why I was overreacting. The hope disappeared as fast as it came. I asked if he seriously thought a counselor would tell me I was wrong for wanting basic consideration. He said a professional could give us both perspective. I realized he expected the counselor to fix me, not help us both change. The flowers stayed on the counter. I didn't put them in water. I told Roger we could do counseling, but only if we picked someone together. He looked at me like I'd just accused him of something terrible and said he wouldn't try to stack the deck in his favor. I pointed out that he'd just suggested the counselor would help me understand why I was overreacting, which sounded exactly like stacking the deck. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. He walked away, and I heard the guest room door close again. At work the next day, Nadine from accounting stopped by my desk during lunch. She asked if I was doing okay because I seemed different lately. I'd worked with Nadine for 6 years, but we mostly just made small talk about weekend plans and complained about the coffee machine. I hesitated, but something about her genuine concern made me give her the short version of the birthday situation. She stared at me with her mouth slightly open and didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds. Then she told me her husband would be sleeping in a hotel if he pulled that crap. She said it loud enough that 2 people at nearby desks looked over. I felt my face get hot, but also something like relief that someone else thought Roger's behavior was actually wrong. Nadine pulled up a chair and told me about the early years of her marriage. She said her husband used to leave his dirty dishes by the sink instead of putting them in the dishwasher. She'd asked him nicely to put them away, and he'd say he would, but then wouldn't do it. This went on for months until she stopped doing his laundry. He asked where his clean clothes were, and she told him she only washed dishes that made it into the dishwasher, so she only washed clothes that made it into the hamper. His stuff had been on the floor. He tried to argue that she was being petty, and she told him she refused to accept treatment she wouldn't give him. She said she'd never leave his dishes by the sink expecting him to deal with them, so why should she accept him doing it to her? He started putting his dishes in the dishwasher that same day. Nadine looked at me and said, "Marriage only works when both people give the same effort." She said I'd been accepting less than I gave for 9 years, and that wasn't a marriage. It was me being Roger's personal assistant. Her words hit me like cold water. I'd been telling myself maybe I was too sensitive about birthdays. Maybe Roger just showed love differently. Maybe I needed to communicate better. But Nadine was right. I'd been gaslighting myself for years, making excuses for Roger's behavior instead of seeing it for what it was. He treated his birthday like a national holiday, and mine like any random Tuesday, because he genuinely believed his mattered more than mine. And I'd let him believe that by going along with it year after year. 2 days later, Roger told me he'd found a marriage counselor and booked us an appointment for Thursday at 6. I asked when he was planning to check if that time worked for me. He said someone had to take initiative since I was dragging my feet about finding someone. I felt that familiar anger rising in my chest. I told him he'd just made a unilateral decision about our joint counseling, which was exactly the kind of thing we needed counseling about. He rolled his eyes and said I was being difficult on purpose. I wrote down the appointment time and didn't say anything else. Thursday came and we drove to the counselor's office in silence. Roger kept adjusting his shirt collar and checking his phone. The counselor's name was Marlena, and her office was in a small building downtown with plants in every corner. She was maybe 50 with gray streaks in her dark hair, and she smiled at both of us like we were interesting instead of broken. She asked us to tell her why we were there. Roger started talking before I could open my mouth. He said we'd been having some disagreements lately and he wanted to work on our communication. Marlena nodded and asked him to be more specific. He said I'd been upset about some birthday stuff and he wanted to understand my perspective better. Marlena turned to me and asked if I agreed with Roger's description. I said that was one way to describe 9 years of him ignoring my birthday, while expecting elaborate celebrations for his. Roger shifted in his seat and said I was exaggerating. Marlena held up her hand and asked Roger to let me finish speaking. I kept talking, and Roger interrupted twice more in the next 10 minutes. Each time Marlena stopped him and asked him to wait until I was done. I could see his jaw getting tighter each time she did it. Marlena asked Roger to describe a recent conflict between us. He said I'd suddenly become unreasonable after years of peaceful marriage. He said we'd always had a good relationship until I decided to cancel his birthday plans without warning. He made it sound like I'd woken up one day and randomly decided to ruin his birthday for fun. I interrupted and said that wasn't accurate at all. I pulled out my journal and started reading entries from the past 9 years. Roger's 40th birthday when he went golfing and came home asking why dinner wasn't ready. My 38th birthday when he told me my gift was married to him. My 36th birthday when he said birthdays were for kids. Marlena listened to every word and took notes. When I finished reading, she asked if she could see the journal at our next session. Roger looked like he'd been slapped. The drive home was awful. Roger gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He said I'd made him look bad by bringing the journal and ambushing him with details. I told him those details were our actual history, and if the truth made him look bad, maybe he should examine his behavior instead of blaming me for documenting it. He said I was twisting everything to make him seem like a villain. I asked him which part I'd twisted. He didn't answer. The next morning, Roger accused me of turning the counselor against him. He said Marlena was clearly biased toward women and only listened to my side. I reminded him that he'd picked Marlena without consulting me. I said he couldn't claim bias just because she wasn't automatically agreeing with him. He said that wasn't the point, and I was missing what he was trying to say. I asked what he was trying to say. He went to work without answering. The next few days felt like living with a stranger who kept changing personalities. Roger would give me the silent treatment for hours, walking past me without making eye contact. Then he'd suddenly try to be overly nice in ways that felt fake and calculated. He brought home takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant on Tuesday and set it on the counter with this expectant look on his face. I thanked him for the food and started eating. He kept watching me like he was waiting for something. Finally, he asked if I liked it. I said yes, it was good. He looked confused and a little hurt that I wasn't treating his gesture like he'd just solved world hunger. I realized he thought bringing home one bag of takeout would fix 9 years of dismissing my feelings. My phone rang Friday evening while I was folding laundry. The caller ID showed my sister Sloane. I almost didn't answer because I wasn't ready to explain everything yet, but I knew she'd just keep calling. I picked up and she immediately asked what was going on with Roger. She said she'd seen Phoebe's vague Facebook posts about family loyalty and heard through the family grapevine that Roger and I were having problems. I sat down on the bed and told her everything. The 9 years of ignored birthdays, the journal, the canceled party, the counseling sessions, all of it. When I finished, Sloane was quiet for a moment. Then she said she'd been waiting years for me to stand up to him. I hadn't expected Sloane to say that. She told me she'd watched Roger treat me like I didn't matter for years, and felt guilty for staying quiet. She said our mom had noticed it too, and even our cousin brought it up at Christmas 2 years ago, when Roger spent the whole dinner talking about his promotion, while cutting me off every time I tried to share news about my own work. Sloane said they'd all agreed it wasn't their place to interfere in my marriage, but now she wished someone had spoken up sooner. She apologized 3 times and said she'd support whatever I decided to do next, whether that meant staying with Roger or leaving him. After we hung up, I sat on the bed for a long time just staring at the wall. I felt validated but also angry that everyone had seen what was happening and nobody said anything until I made a scene by canceling Roger's birthday. The next morning, I opened my laptop while Roger was in the shower and started searching for information about living alone. I pulled up rental listings in my area and calculated what I could afford with just my salary. The number surprised me. I made enough to rent a decent 1-bedroom apartment and still have money left over for groceries and bills. My secret savings account had grown to almost $4,000, enough for a security deposit and first month's rent with some cushion left over. I opened a spreadsheet and started listing all our shared expenses, figuring out which ones I'd need to cover alone and which ones would disappear if I left. The math worked. I could actually do this if I needed to. That realization felt terrifying and exciting at the same time, like standing at the edge of something huge and unknown. I heard the shower turn off and quickly closed all the tabs on my laptop. Roger walked into the bedroom wrapped in a towel, his hair still dripping. He glanced at my screen and asked what I was working on. I told him it was just work stuff and closed the laptop completely, my heart beating faster than it should have been. He looked at me for a second like he wanted to ask more questions, then shrugged and went to get dressed. I sat there feeling guilty about lying, but also protective of the information I'd just gathered, like I needed to keep it safe until I figured out what to do with it. Our second counseling session happened 3 days later. Marlena had my journal sitting on the side table when we walked in. She said she'd read through all 9 years of entries and wanted to discuss them with both of us. Roger shifted in his seat and crossed his arms. Marlena opened the journal to a page she'd marked and asked Roger how he thought his behavior over those 9 years had affected me. He was quiet for what felt like forever, then said he didn't mean to hurt my feelings. Marlena waited for him to say more, but he just sat there looking uncomfortable. She asked him to be more specific about what he understood about the impact of his actions. Roger said he guessed I felt ignored on my birthdays, but he never thought it was a big deal because we were both adults. Marlena wrote something down and asked if that was all he had to say after reading 9 years of documented hurt. Roger said he wasn't good with feelings and didn't know what else she wanted him to say. Marlena put the journal down and introduced a new topic called emotional labor. She asked Roger to describe everything I did to make his birthday special. He sat up a little straighter and started listing things. The restaurant reservations, the gift shopping, the party planning, the coordination with his friends and family, the custom cakes, the perfect wrapping, the surprise elements. He talked for almost 5 minutes about all the work I put in, and I could tell he was proud of how well I'd always celebrated him. Then Marlena asked what he did for my birthdays. Roger opened his mouth and then closed it again. He said he usually said happy birthday. Marlena asked what else. Roger looked at the floor and admitted there wasn't much else. She let that sit in the silence between us for a full minute before moving on. The session ended with Marlena giving Roger homework. She asked him to write down everything he appreciated about me and everything he contributed to our relationship beyond his paycheck. Roger took the paper she handed him and nodded. On the drive home, he complained that therapy was supposed to help us get along better, not make him feel worse about himself. I didn't respond. When we got home, he went straight to his office and closed the door. I made dinner alone and ate alone while he stayed in there working on something. The next week came and went. Roger's homework paper stayed blank on his desk. I saw it there when I walked past his office, just sitting under a coffee mug with nothing written on it. Our third counseling session arrived and Marlena asked Roger to share what he'd written. He said he'd been too busy with work projects to finish the assignment. Marlena looked at him for a long moment and then asked if he'd had any free time that week. Roger said not really. Everything had been crazy at the office. Marlena pulled out her phone and showed him something. She'd asked me earlier in the week to track Roger's schedule, and I'd sent her a list of his activities. She read it out loud. Golf on Tuesday afternoon, golf again on Thursday morning, poker night on Friday, football on Sunday. Marlena asked Roger to examine his priorities and explain how he'd found time for 4 recreational activities, but couldn't find 30 minutes to complete homework that might save his marriage. Roger's face turned red. He said those activities helped him relax and manage stress from work. Marlena asked if his marriage was less important than golf. Roger said that wasn't fair and she was twisting his words. She asked him to explain what he meant then. Roger got louder and said he was tired of being treated like the villain in every session when he'd been a good husband for 9 years. He said he provided for our household, he never cheated, he never hit me, and he showed up to counseling even though he didn't think we needed it. Marlena stayed calm and said those were baseline expectations for any partner, not special achievements that deserved credit. She said not being abusive wasn't something he should expect praise for, because that was the bare minimum of human decency. Roger looked like she'd slapped him. I could see him trying to think of a comeback, but nothing came out. Then I spoke up for the first time that session. I said I was tired of being grateful for the bare minimum while Roger expected constant celebration and acknowledgement for every little thing he did. I said I'd spent 9 years making him feel special and important while he made me feel invisible and unworthy of the same effort. I told him clearly that I deserved the same consideration and effort I'd given him all those years, and if he couldn't understand that, then maybe we didn't belong together. My voice didn't shake. I didn't cry. I just said what I needed to say, and then stopped talking. Roger went quiet after that. He didn't argue or defend himself. He just sat there staring at his hands. The session ended, and we drove home in complete silence. When we got to the house, Roger went straight to the garage instead of coming inside. About 20 minutes later, I heard another car pull up and saw Michael getting out. He walked into the garage and the door closed behind him. I could hear their voices through the wall but couldn't make out the words. They stayed out there for over 2 hours. I wondered what version of our story Roger was telling his friend, whether he was painting himself as the victim or actually being honest about his behavior. I made dinner and ate alone again, then went upstairs to read. The garage door finally opened around 9 and I heard Michael's car leave. Roger came inside and went straight to bed without saying anything to me. He looked shaken up in a way I hadn't seen before, like something Michael said had gotten through to him in a way Marlena and I couldn't. I heard the front door close and footsteps coming back toward the house. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway where I was sitting with my book. He looked uncomfortable but determined, like he'd made up his mind about something difficult. He asked if we could talk for a minute before he left. I nodded and put my book down, expecting him to make excuses for Roger or try to smooth things over like friends usually do. Instead, he sat down across from me and said Roger had told him everything, including about the journal entries I'd kept for 9 years. He said he had no idea Roger had been ignoring my birthdays while expecting me to make his into major events. Michael's voice was steady and serious when he told me he'd called Roger a selfish jerk who needed to grow up. I just stared at him, completely caught off guard by his honesty. I'd assumed he would automatically take Roger's side because that's what friends do, especially guy friends who stick together no matter what. Michael must have seen my surprise because he kept talking. He explained that his own wife had set him straight years ago about similar behavior, back when he thought providing money meant he didn't need to put in emotional effort. He said she'd threatened to leave him if he didn't start treating her like an equal partner, instead of someone who should be grateful for his paycheck. Michael looked me in the eye and said he was grateful she'd been tough with him before he destroyed their marriage the way Roger was destroying ours. He told me I was doing the right thing by standing up for myself, and that Roger needed to hear hard truths from multiple people, not just from me. I thanked him quietly, still processing the fact that Roger's best friend since college had just validated everything I'd been feeling. Michael stood up to leave and paused at the door. He said Roger was lucky to have me and needed to figure that out before it was too late. Then he left, and I sat there in the kitchen feeling less alone than I had in months. About 10 minutes later, the garage door opened and Roger came inside. His face looked different, sort of shaken and pale in a way I hadn't seen before. He walked slowly into the kitchen and leaned against the counter instead of sitting down. Roger admitted that Michael hadn't held back about calling out his behavior, that his friend had been brutally honest about how badly he'd been treating me. He said maybe he needed to hear these things from his friends, and not just from me and Marlena, the counselor he kept trying to dismiss as biased. Roger's voice was quiet, and he wasn't making eye contact, just staring at the floor tiles. He looked genuinely rattled by whatever Michael had said to him during those 2 hours in the garage. I didn't say anything, just waited to see if he'd actually do something different, or if this was another temporary moment of awareness that would fade by tomorrow. He asked if I wanted anything and I said no. Roger nodded and went upstairs without his usual routine of checking his phone or turning on the TV. I stayed in the kitchen thinking about how strange it felt to see him actually affected by criticism from someone other than me. The next week brought small changes that felt weird and uncomfortable. Roger started asking about my day when he got home from work, and instead of half listening while scrolling through his phone, he actually looked at me and seemed to pay attention to my answers. He offered to make dinner twice without me asking or hinting. He remembered I had a dentist appointment and asked how it went when I got home. The efforts felt stiff and unnatural, like he was following a script or checking items off a list of things good husbands should do. I could tell he was trying, but it didn't feel genuine yet. More like someone performing actions they'd been told were important without really understanding why. Still, I acknowledged his attempts because they were more than he'd done in years. When he asked about my project at work, I gave him real details instead of the usual brief summary I'd learned to provide. When he made spaghetti for dinner, I thanked him and said it was good, even though the sauce was watery. These tiny interactions felt like we were learning a new language together, stumbling over words and grammar, but at least making the effort to communicate. Part of me stayed guarded, waiting for him to get tired of trying and slip back into old patterns. Part of me felt cautiously hopeful that maybe this could actually lead somewhere different. My birthday started creeping into my awareness like an approaching storm. The date sat on the calendar, getting closer each day, and the tension in the house grew thicker with all the things we weren't saying out loud. Roger knew this was a test. I knew this was a test. We both moved around each other carefully, overly polite in a way that felt exhausting. He'd glance at me sometimes with this nervous expression, like he was trying to read my mind and figure out what I expected. I caught myself doing the same thing, wondering if he'd actually remember this year, or if the past week of small efforts would evaporate when it mattered. The unspoken pressure made everything feel heavy and strange. We'd have normal conversations about groceries or whether to call the plumber about the bathroom sink, but underneath every interaction was this awareness that something important was coming. Roger seemed jumpy and distracted, checking his phone more than usual but in a different way than before, like he was looking up information instead of just scrolling mindlessly. I tried to focus on work and my normal routine, but the approaching date kept pulling at my attention. 9 years of nothing had taught me not to hope, but the past week of changes made it impossible not to wonder if this time might actually be different. 3 days before my birthday, Roger found me in the living room folding laundry. He stood in the doorway looking nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Then he asked directly what I wanted to do to celebrate my birthday. The question hit me like cold water. After 9 years of silence and dismissal, I didn't know how to respond to such a straightforward, normal question. My brain seemed to freeze up, unable to form an answer. I'd spent so long training myself not to expect anything, not to even think about what I might want, that when faced with the actual question, I had nothing ready. Roger waited while I stood there holding a towel, my mouth opening and closing without words coming out. I could see hurt flash across his face, like my inability to answer immediately was rejection. He asked if I was okay, and I managed to say I needed to think about it. Roger's shoulders dropped and he nodded slowly before leaving the room. I finished folding the laundry in silence, annoyed with myself for not being able to just say something simple like dinner or a movie. But the truth was I genuinely didn't know what I wanted because I'd stopped letting myself want anything years ago. At our next counseling session, I told Marlena about Roger's question and my frozen response. She listened carefully, and then explained that I was protecting myself from disappointment, which made complete sense after years of being let down. Marlena said my reaction was totally normal and reasonable given my history. She asked what would feel safe to ask for, something that wouldn't devastate me if Roger messed it up. I thought about it during the session while Roger sat quietly beside me, not interrupting or defending himself for once. Marlena suggested starting small with something specific and manageable, a clear request that Roger could either meet or not meet without ambiguity. The idea of making myself vulnerable again by expressing what I wanted felt scary, but I also knew that if I never asked for anything, nothing would ever change. By the end of the session, I decided what felt manageable as a first step. Marlena seemed pleased and told Roger this was his opportunity to show through actions instead of just words that he was actually changing. Roger nodded seriously and said he understood. That evening after dinner, I told Roger what I wanted. I said I wanted a nice dinner at a restaurant I would choose, and I wanted him to plan and arrange everything without me having to provide detailed instructions or reminders. I explained this felt like a reasonable test of whether he could put in real effort without me doing all the emotional labor of managing the process. Roger listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said okay. He looked nervous, but also determined, like he recognized how important this was. I gave him the name of a restaurant I'd mentioned loving several months ago, curious if he'd remember me talking about it or if he'd need me to explain why I picked that place. Roger wrote down the name on his phone and said he'd take care of everything. The conversation felt formal and slightly awkward, like we were negotiating a business arrangement instead of planning a birthday celebration. But at least we were communicating clearly about expectations, instead of me hoping he'd magically figure out what I needed. Over the next 2 days, I caught Roger researching restaurants on his phone multiple times. He'd be sitting on the couch with his laptop open, scrolling through reviews and menus with a focused expression. I saw him making notes in a small notebook he usually only used for work projects. Every instinct in my body wanted to help him, to offer suggestions or check if he needed anything. I'd spent so many years managing every detail of our lives that watching him struggle felt uncomfortable and wrong. But I forced myself to stay quiet and let him figure things out on his own. This was the whole point of the test, to see if he could actually handle planning something without me doing half the work. When he asked me once if I had any food allergies he'd forgotten about, I just reminded him I'm allergic to shellfish like I've been our entire marriage. He nodded and wrote that down too. Watching him put in visible effort created this weird mix of feelings in my chest, something between hope and fear that I couldn't quite name. My birthday morning arrived and I woke up to the smell of coffee. Roger was standing beside the bed holding a mug and a card in his hands. He looked nervous and almost shy, completely different from his usual morning gruffness. I sat up and he handed me the coffee first, made exactly how I like it with cream and 1 sugar. Then he gave me the card, which had flowers on the front and looked like he'd spent actual time picking it out instead of grabbing the first one he saw. I opened it and the printed message inside was generic birthday wishes, but below that, Roger had written several lines in his own handwriting. The note acknowledged the 9 years he'd missed and ignored, admitting he'd been selfish and wrong. He wrote that he was sorry and wanted to do better, that he was starting to understand how much he'd taken me for granted. The handwriting was messy, and some words were crossed out where he'd changed his mind about what to say. Reading his words made my throat tight and my eyes burn with tears I wasn't ready to let fall. I looked up at Roger and he was watching my face anxiously, waiting for my reaction. I told him thank you, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. He smiled slightly and said the reservation was at 7, and that I should wear whatever I wanted because tonight was completely about me. I spent the rest of the morning in a strange state between hope and fear. Roger left for work early, kissing my forehead before he went, which felt like something from years ago before everything became routine and resentment. I got ready slowly, trying on 3 different outfits before settling on a simple dress I'd bought months ago but never worn. The effort felt important somehow, like I was meeting someone new instead of having dinner with my husband. Work dragged by in a blur of emails and meetings where I contributed just enough to seem present while my mind kept circling back to tonight. Nadine stopped by my desk during lunch and asked if I was feeling okay because I seemed distracted. I told her it was my birthday, and Roger was taking me to dinner. She raised her eyebrows and asked if this was the same Roger who'd ignored my birthday for 9 years. I said yes, and that he seemed to be trying to change things. She squeezed my shoulder and told me to enjoy it, but keep my eyes open. The restaurant Roger chose was actually the place I'd mentioned back in March when my coworker brought in leftovers that smelled amazing. I'd commented that I wanted to try it sometime, just a casual remark during lunch break that I didn't think anyone was listening to. Roger must have written it down or saved it in his phone somehow. This realization hit me while I was finishing a report, and I had to stop typing because my hands were shaking slightly. He'd actually paid attention to something I said instead of waiting for me to organize everything. When I got home at 5:30, Roger was already there, which never happened on weekdays. He'd changed into nice pants and a button-down shirt, not the expensive designer stuff he usually wore for his own celebrations, just clean and presentable. He asked if I needed time to get ready, and I said I'd be quick. In the bedroom, I touched up my makeup and changed into the dress, studying myself in the mirror and trying to remember the last time Roger and I went on an actual date. Maybe 3 years ago for our anniversary, and even then he'd spent half the dinner on his phone responding to work emails. I came downstairs and Roger looked up from his phone where he was checking the reservation time. He told me I looked beautiful, and the compliment sounded genuine instead of automatic. We drove to the restaurant in his car with the radio playing quietly between us. The silence felt heavy but not hostile, more like we were both nervous about what this evening meant. Roger parked and came around to open my door, which surprised me enough that I just stared at him for a second before getting out. Inside the restaurant, the host checked Roger's reservation and led us to a table by the window. The place was nicer than I expected, with soft lighting and actual tablecloths instead of paper. Roger pulled out my chair before sitting down across from me. We looked at menus and I could feel him watching me, probably trying to gauge my reaction to everything. The waiter came and Roger ordered wine without asking what I wanted first, then caught himself and asked if that was okay. I said it was fine and he looked relieved. We made small talk about work and the weather, both of us avoiding the bigger conversation hovering between us. When our food arrived, Roger asked about a project I'd mentioned weeks ago, and I realized he'd actually remembered details I'd told him. This kept happening throughout dinner, him referencing things I'd said in passing, demonstrating he'd been listening even when I thought he was tuned out. The evening felt strange and slightly uncomfortable, like we were learning how to talk to each other again after years of just existing in the same house. After we finished eating, Roger pulled a wrapped box from under his chair. The wrapping was messy and clearly done by him, not by a store employee, which somehow made it more meaningful. I opened it carefully and found a set of professional art supplies, watercolors and brushes, and thick paper designed for painting. I looked up at him confused because this wasn't something I'd asked for or expected. Roger explained that I'd mentioned months ago wanting to try painting, just a random comment while we were watching a home improvement show. He said he'd researched what beginners needed and picked supplies that would be good for learning. I touched the brushes and felt tears burning behind my eyes because this gift showed he'd listened to something I cared about instead of buying what he thought I should want. I thanked him, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. Roger reached across the table and took my hand, saying he knew one good birthday didn't fix 9 years of being selfish and wrong. He said he understood if I didn't trust this yet, and that he had a lot of work to do to prove he was actually changing. I squeezed his hand and told him this birthday felt different, really different, but that I needed to see consistent effort over time, not just one nice day. Roger nodded and said he was rebuilding trust he'd destroyed through years of entitled behavior, and he knew that would take time. We sat there holding hands across the table while the waiter cleared our plates, and for the first time in years, I felt like maybe we could actually fix what was broken between us. The drive home was quieter but more comfortable, and when we got inside, Roger asked if I wanted to try the art supplies. I said maybe tomorrow because I was tired from the emotional weight of the day. He kissed me goodnight at the bedroom door, a real kiss instead of the quick peck we'd been doing for months, and told me happy birthday one more time. I lay in bed that night holding the card he'd given me that morning, reading his messy handwriting over and over, trying to decide if I believed this change was real or just temporary performance. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Nancy's name appeared on the screen and I considered not answering, but curiosity won. I picked up and she asked how my birthday was, her tone suggesting Roger had already told her he'd made an effort. I kept my voice neutral and said it was nice, that Roger took me to dinner and got me a thoughtful gift. Nancy made a sound of approval and said she was glad Roger was being a good husband again. The phrase made my jaw tighten because it implied he'd just had a brief lapse instead of 9 years of consistent selfishness. I told her I appreciated her calling but needed to get to work. She said she hoped things would go back to normal now, and I said we were working on finding a new normal, not going back to the old one. The distinction seemed to confuse her, and she ended the call quickly. I felt satisfied that I'd maintained my boundary without being rude, refusing to absolve her of enabling Roger's behavior just because he'd managed one decent birthday. Roger and I had our next counseling session that Thursday. Marlena asked how my birthday went, and I described the dinner and the gift, while Roger sat beside me looking nervous. Marlena acknowledged that Roger had made genuine effort, and that planning something thoughtful was real progress. Then she looked at both of us seriously and said one good day didn't mean the underlying problems were solved. She explained that real change required sustained effort over months, not isolated gestures when the pressure was on. Marlena assigned us new homework about identifying the beliefs and patterns that created our dynamic. She wanted us to separately write about messages we'd received growing up about gender roles and relationships, then discuss them together. Roger shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but agreed to do the assignment. On the drive home, he was quiet, and I could tell he was processing what Marlena said about sustained effort. That weekend, we sat at the kitchen table with our homework sheets. Roger had actually filled his out, which surprised me since he'd skipped the last assignment. He'd written about his family, and how his mother always centered his father's needs, how birthdays and holidays revolved around making the men happy. I read through his answers and saw him struggling with concepts he'd never questioned before. When we discussed it together, Roger admitted he'd internalized messages about men being more important and deserving more attention. He said he'd never thought about whether that was fair or true, just accepted it as normal because that was how his family operated. This moment felt significant, watching him genuinely reflect on beliefs he'd held his entire life. I told him I appreciated his honesty, and that recognizing these patterns was the first step toward changing them. Roger asked about my homework, and I shared how I'd learned to make myself smaller, to manage everyone's emotions and needs while ignoring my own. We talked for over an hour, the longest real conversation we'd had in years. The following week, we started having actual conversations about household responsibilities. Roger seemed genuinely surprised when I listed everything I did that he never noticed. The mental load of tracking groceries, scheduling appointments, remembering birthdays for his family, planning meals, managing our social calendar, all the invisible work that kept our life running smoothly. He'd thought we split things equally because we both worked and paid bills, not realizing that I was doing 10 additional hours of unpacking and organizing and planning every week. Roger said he'd never thought about it that way, and asked what he could take on. We made a list together of specific tasks he'd handle without being asked or reminded. He'd do the grocery shopping using a list he maintained, schedule his own appointments and remember them, and take over planning for his family's birthdays and holidays. I felt skeptical about whether he'd follow through, but I appreciated that he was willing to try. 3 weeks after my birthday, Roger was still maintaining most of his new behaviors. He'd slip occasionally, like forgetting to add something to the grocery list, or starting to interrupt me before catching himself. But he was making visible effort, and I noticed him genuinely trying to remember things I mentioned and show interest in my life. He'd ask about my day and actually listen to my answer instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He'd check in about plans before making commitments that affected both of us. Small changes that added up to feeling like he saw me as a person instead of a supporting character in his life. One afternoon, my sister Sloane came over for coffee. She'd been hearing updates from me about the counseling and Roger's efforts, but she wanted to see for herself how things were going. We sat in the living room and Roger joined us, making conversation instead of disappearing to watch TV. Sloane asked him about work, and he answered, then turned the question back to her and listened to her response. After an hour, Sloane said she needed to run errands and Roger walked her to the door. When he went upstairs to change for the gym, Sloane pulled me aside in the kitchen. She told me quietly that she could see real change in how Roger treated me, that he was engaging instead of dismissing. She warned me to protect myself and stay aware, but acknowledged he seemed to be doing the difficult work of examining his entitled beliefs. I thanked her for being honest and for supporting me through everything. After she left, I sat on the couch and thought about how far we'd come in just a few weeks, and how much further we still needed to go before I could fully trust that this change was permanent. Roger's birthday started showing up on the calendar, and I watched him get quieter each day it got closer. He'd look at the date and then look at me, like he was waiting for something to happen. I caught him checking his phone more often, scrolling through old photos from his big parties. He didn't say anything about what he wanted or drop hints about gifts. He just seemed worried about what I'd do. I'd already decided weeks before that I'd plan something nice but normal. Not the huge production with 50 people and custom cakes. Just a good dinner at a restaurant he liked and a gift that showed I'd been paying attention. When the day came, I made reservations at the Italian place near our house. Roger seemed surprised when I told him to be ready by 6. He asked if other people were coming and I said no, just us. He nodded and said that sounded good and I could see him relax a little. At dinner, Roger ordered his usual pasta and we talked about work and the house. Normal stuff. When the server brought out a small cake with a candle, Roger smiled and thanked me. After he blew it out, he reached across the table and took my hand. He said he appreciated me celebrating with him and that he knew his old expectations were crazy and unfair. He said he was learning to be happy with gestures instead of demanding performances. I squeezed his hand back and told him I could see him trying. The gift I got him was a book about vintage cars that he'd mentioned wanting months ago. He held it for a long time and said it meant a lot that I'd remembered. The whole evening felt different from every birthday before. No stress, no huge bills, no feeling like I had to prove something. Just 2 people having dinner together. Nancy called the next day and asked how the birthday went. I kept my answer short and said we had a nice dinner. She made a comment about it being smaller than usual, her voice doing that thing where she wasn't quite asking a question but wanted me to explain. Before I could say anything, Roger took the phone from me. He told his mother that simpler celebrations worked better for both of us, and that we decided together to do things differently. Nancy went quiet on the other end. Roger kept talking, saying he'd spent too many years making birthdays into a big deal when they didn't need to be. He said he was happy with how things went and hoped she could understand. After he hung up, I stared at him. He'd just set a boundary with his mother about our marriage. He'd defended our choice to her face instead of letting her make me feel bad about it. Roger shrugged and said he'd been thinking about what the counselor said about family patterns. He said his mom had always made him feel like his birthday was the most important day of the year, and he'd carried that into our marriage without questioning it. Now he was questioning it. Phoebe posted about Roger's birthday on social media, but it was just a normal message wishing him a good year. No long paragraph about how amazing he was, or childhood photos, or inside jokes. Just a regular birthday post like people write for friends. I scrolled through it twice, surprised by how different it looked from her usual style. When I asked Roger about it later that night, he admitted he'd talked to his sister a few weeks before. He'd told her that the way she treated me versus how she treated him wasn't fair, and he'd asked her to show both of us the same respect. Phoebe had apparently gotten defensive at first, saying she didn't realize she was doing anything wrong. Roger said he'd given her specific examples of times she'd ignored my birthday while making a huge deal about his. She'd apologized and said she'd try to do better. I asked Roger what made him have that conversation, and he said he'd been noticing patterns he'd never seen before. All the little ways his family had always centered him and treated me like I was just there to support him. He said once he started seeing it, he couldn't unsee it. Our next counseling session with Marlena felt different too. She asked us both how we'd been doing with the communication exercises she'd assigned, and Roger had actually done them this time. He'd written down specific things he appreciated about me and ways he wanted to contribute more to our relationship. Marlena read through his notes and nodded. She said she could see real progress in how we talked to each other, and how Roger was taking responsibility for his part in our problems. She suggested we start spacing out our sessions since we were developing healthier patterns. We could move to every other week instead of every week, and then to once a month if things kept improving. Marlena made it clear that the hard part would be keeping up these changes long term, not just until therapy ended. She said a lot of couples did great in counseling and then slipped back into old habits once they stopped coming. Roger said he didn't want that to happen, and I agreed. We scheduled our next appointment for 2 weeks out instead of one. On the drive home, Roger brought up birthday traditions. He said he'd been thinking about how we could do birthdays going forward in a way that felt good for both of us. Not his old pattern of expensive demands and huge parties, but also not nothing. We sat in the driveway after he parked and talked through ideas. Roger suggested we could each pick one thing we really wanted to do, something that felt special, but didn't require months of planning or tons of money. Quality time together instead of performances for other people. I said I liked that idea, and we started making a list on his phone. Day trips to places we'd never been, trying new restaurants, taking a class together, things that were about spending time with each other instead of showing off or keeping up appearances. Roger saved the list and said we'd use it for both our birthdays from now on. Equal effort, equal thought, equal celebration. A few days later, I was paying bills at the kitchen table when Roger walked in to get coffee. He glanced at the papers spread out and froze. I looked up and saw him staring at a bank statement from my separate account. The one I'd been hiding and using for my spa day and other things I didn't want to explain. My whole body went tight, waiting for him to get mad or accuse me of planning to leave. Roger picked up his coffee mug and took a sip. Then he said he understood why I needed that security after everything that had happened. He said he got it, that I needed to know I had options and wasn't trapped. He didn't ask how much was in it or what I planned to do with it. He just said he understood and walked back out of the kitchen. I sat there staring at the statement, surprised by how he'd reacted. The old Roger would have exploded about secrets and trust. This Roger seemed to get that trust had to be rebuilt slowly, and that meant accepting I wasn't ready to feel completely safe yet. Our anniversary came up a few weeks later. We'd barely acknowledged it the past few years, both of us too tired and resentful to pretend we were happy. This year felt different. Roger suggested we go out to dinner, somewhere nice but not over the top. We ended up at a steakhouse downtown, sitting across from each other in a booth. Roger ordered wine and we toasted to our anniversary. He said something that surprised me. He said we'd almost destroyed our marriage and it had been mostly his fault. He said he'd been too entitled and selfish to see my worth, and he'd almost lost me because of it. I told him I'd been close to leaving, that I'd looked into what divorce would cost and what my life would look like alone. Roger said he was glad I'd stayed long enough to give him a chance to change. We talked about how far we'd come and how much work it had taken. The conversation felt real and honest, without either of us trying to make ourselves look better or avoid hard truths. When we got home, Roger pulled me close and said thank you for not giving up on him. I said thank you for finally showing up. 6 months had passed since the birthday that changed everything. Half a year of Roger doing the work, of me slowly learning to trust again, of both of us figuring out how to be actual partners. Our relationship felt completely different now. More balanced, more equal, more like we were on the same team. Roger kept up his efforts without me having to remind him or manage him. He did the grocery shopping every week, remembered his own family's birthdays, and asked me about my day like he actually cared about the answer. I'd stopped keeping score in my head, stopped building up resentment about invisible labor. When something bothered me, I said it out loud instead of writing it in my journal. We still had bad days where old patterns tried to creep back in, but we caught them faster now. Roger would start to interrupt me and then stop himself. I'd start to take over a task he'd agreed to handle and then step back. We were both learning new ways of being together, and it felt like we were building something better than what we'd had before. Nadine pulled me aside at work one afternoon and said I seemed different lately. Happier, more confident, not carrying around that heavy weight I used to have. I told her things were genuinely better at home, that Roger had done serious work on himself and our marriage. She asked if I trusted it would last, and I said I was hopeful but still careful. I told her about keeping my separate account and how Roger had seen the statement and just were accepted it. Nadine nodded and said that was a good sign, that real change meant respecting my need for security. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself and not accepting less than I deserved. I thanked her for being someone I could talk to about everything, for validating my feelings when I'd thought I was crazy for being upset. She hugged me and said that's what friends were for. Walking back to my desk, I thought about how much had shifted in half a year. How I'd gone from invisible and taken for granted to actually seen and valued. How Roger had gone from entitled and oblivious to aware and trying. How we'd both learned that real love required equal effort, mutual respect, and the willingness to change when you'd been wrong. A month later, Roger came home from work on a Wednesday and told me to pack a bag for the weekend. I looked up from my laptop, confused, because there was nothing on the calendar, and neither of us had birthdays or anniversaries coming up. He said he'd booked a cabin 2 hours north and wanted to spend some quiet time together, just the two of us. I asked what the occasion was, and he said there wasn't one, that he just wanted to be with me away from regular life and responsibilities. The gesture caught me off guard in the best way because it felt completely natural, not like he was checking a box or trying to prove something. We left Friday afternoon and spent the weekend hiking, cooking simple meals, and talking about things we never seemed to make time for at home. Roger asked about my childhood, and listened to stories I'd told before without interrupting or changing the subject to himself. We played cards and watched old movies and didn't check our phones except to take a few pictures. On Sunday morning, Roger made coffee and brought it to me on the porch, sitting down beside me without saying anything for a while. He eventually said he was grateful I'd given him the chance to become someone worth being married to, and I told him I was grateful he'd done the work, instead of just pretending to change. The weekend felt like proof that our relationship had shifted into something more balanced, where both of us considered the other person's happiness without keeping score or expecting constant recognition. 2 weeks after we got back, Roger suggested dinner at a new Italian place downtown. We were halfway through our meal when I spotted Michael and his wife walking in. Roger waved them over and invited them to join us, pulling up 2 extra chairs before I could say whether I was comfortable with it. Michael's wife, Sarah, sat next to me and we started talking about work while the guys caught up. After our entrees arrived, Sarah excused herself to the bathroom and gestured for me to come with her. Once we were alone, she said Michael had told her everything about the birthday situation and the journal and how close Roger and I had come to ending our marriage. She said she was proud of me for standing up for myself instead of just accepting being treated like I didn't matter. Sarah told me Michael had come home from that garage conversation with Roger and admitted he'd been guilty of similar behavior early in their marriage, taking her for granted while expecting her to celebrate him. She said my refusal to keep enabling Roger had actually helped their relationship too, because it made Michael examine his own patterns. I thanked her and said I'd been terrified of losing my marriage, but more terrified of spending the rest of my life invisible and resentful. Sarah squeezed my hand and said giving Roger the chance to grow after making him face consequences was the right choice, and she could see how much work he'd put into changing. That night after dinner, I went home and pulled out my journal from the drawer where I'd kept it for years. I flipped through pages of documentation, all those careful records of forgotten birthdays and dismissive comments and one-sided effort. Reading through it now felt different because those patterns didn't exist anymore. Roger had been consistent for months, showing up and putting in effort and treating me like an equal partner. I realized I didn't need to keep documenting bad behavior because there wasn't any bad behavior to document. The journal had served its purpose as proof when Roger tried to gaslight me into thinking I was exaggerating, but now it was just a reminder of where we used to be. I didn't throw it away because that history mattered and I never wanted to forget how close we came to destroying everything. Instead, I put it on the shelf as a marker of the past, not a record of ongoing problems. Roger noticed it sitting there a few days later and asked if I was keeping it as insurance in case he went back to his old ways. I said no, that I was keeping it as a reminder for both of us about what happens when one person stops trying and the other person finally stops accepting it. Months passed and our new patterns became just patterns, not new anymore, but normal. I stopped bracing for disappointment every time Roger said he'd handle something because he actually followed through without me having to remind him or take over. We split household tasks without negotiating or keeping score, both of us just doing what needed doing. Roger asked about my day and actually listened to my answers, asking follow-up questions instead of waiting for his turn to talk about himself. When problems came up, we talked about them right away instead of me writing them down in silence while resentment built. I felt genuinely happy in my marriage for the first time in years, not just content or resigned, but actually happy to come home and spend time with my husband. I'd taught Roger how to be a real partner by refusing to accept anything less than I deserved, and he'd learned that real love required equal effort from both people. We both understood now that mutual respect wasn't something you demanded or withheld as punishment, but something you built through consistent actions and willingness to change when you were wrong. Our marriage wasn't perfect because no marriage is, but it was finally equal, and that made all the difference.